This is Chapter 7 of Unfortunate Citizen. I'm waiting for this helicopter to pass. The day was sunny, apart from a bank of fluffy white clouds which could be seen on the horizon. Judging by the wind out in the plain as it swept over the wild grains, it was likely that it would be about an hour until the clouds would be overhead and provide any kind of shade for the guard. It was not to say that they needed much shade, because as they were plenty protected from both the sun and the eye of anyone coming up the main highway. This road followed along the railroad tracks from Sicily to Florence. The place meant for the ambush, where the princess now waited, was 3 miles outside of the city and 15 miles from the bridge which spanned the Genoa River. It was a perfect place to lay in wait, because there was no other practical way to approach the city with a large force. The guard, every one of them apart from the general, were deployed in the skirmish line along the forested edge of where just over a month before the princess had held the great picking competition. These same woods had children running in them, laughing and chasing, and now they were dead silent. Not even a songbird let out its voice, or a squirrel ran over the branches. They had run at the sound of the army coming into place, and now they had left them to the peculiarly human business of waging battle. The princess held a central position with a roughly even number of troops to her left and right flank. Her foxhole was on a slight hill over the plain below, and it offered the best available position for watching the enemy approach. Even then it wasn't great, because only a mile from their position into the sea of wheat was a ridge a foot or so higher. This meant that despite the overlook, there would be no spotting a potential force before they were nearly on top of them. Despite this disadvantage, and that of knowing nothing of the enemy, the princess was still confident in their element of surprise and wide stance on the battlefield. They could hold off a larger force in a very wide formation, in her mind, if they were to leverage their high standards for marksmanship. She herself was not bad, but not great, and although she would occasionally target shoot with the guard during training, it now seemed woefully inadequate. Moving targets were very different from papers hung at a measly 100 yards. Once again she had her carbine loaded and 10mm pistol ammunition, but this time it was all real. No simulation rounds could be found with any of the guard on this day, but rather the mild steel-jacketed rounds that were common for hunting. These, loaded 6 rounds to each internal magazine in the standard rifle of the guard, were believed to be effective to 500 yards in skilled hands and well-manufactured rifles. The reality was they lost much of their velocity at 300 yards and became very hard to aim, mainly due to the large diameter of rounds settled on so many years before. Bolt action and polish, the rifles were not ideal, but they were what was immediately available. The best that could be said of them in an actual battle is that they were very reliable. This mattered because the princess had in mind a rapid retreat in the case that the enemy broke their line. A quick retreat was necessary, but would be stalled by the positioning of the horses. On the opposite side of the forest, a quarter-mile from the guard at this moment, they would have to cover considerable ground if they needed to race away. And where would they run to if they retreated? Well, this depended on how the first battle unfolded. The princess hoped for a victory, but she knew this was far from certain, and she was forced to consider various options for retreat. One she considered was to fall back to the next best position on the highway that offered a similarly wooded position beside a large open field where the highway passed through. Then from there a fighting retreat could be made all the way to the fort in the city. If the battle was unwinnable and there was no hope for victory, then she would run far north to the city of Genoa. "This will not happen," the princess said to herself over and over. "The enemy army has only existed a short period of time, and their leadership has no real experience. Well," she thought, "neither have I, and yet I am acting commander-in-chief." This inner mantra deteriorated and left the princess with an overwhelming anxiety. Her enemy could have experience that she didn't know of, and they could have weapons she didn't know of, just as the general had suggested. So much of the unknown weighing on the mind of someone who had not slept in almost 2 days was nearly too much to bear. It had become clear to the members of the guard, who allowed themselves the opportunity to reflect, that the timing of this entire thing was very intentional. The night that they were ordered to halt was the last 12 hours of the training maneuvers, and it must have been known that those would be the most hectic and sleep-deprived hours. Final pushes and desperate last stands were bound to come at the end of a war game with no consequences and a set deadline, and by staging the true battle to take place the next day, it assured the invaders that the defenders would already be tired and muddied. At this moment, nearly 8 out of 10 soldiers were asleep. Those other 2 kept watch while the bulk of the force desperately tried to prepare themselves for something they couldn't even make guesses about. Those same questions that plagued the princess weighed on the minds of all the members of the guard, and sleep cruelly avoided most of them reaching out for it. Despite her fears, the princess allowed herself to drift to a fitful sleep for no more than an hour, but when she had awoken, she saw the sun directly overhead beating down on the forest that concealed her and her men. The bank of clouds she had counted on giving relief from the heat had already passed, and she missed every moment of shade while she slept. She had not awoken on her own, but it was rather a soldier shaking her shoulder. Marcus, insisting on staying by her to protect her, was the man who whispered to her. "We see dust on the other side of the ridge. They must be close," he said. Terror shot through Cecilia like a bolt of electricity. Tears almost welled in her eyes, but she wiped at her face until they retreated. She had seen a few members of the guard shed tears today at the fear, but she felt that she shouldn't expose her true feelings like that. Why, she wasn't sure. It may be just the last vestiges of royal courtly manners keeping her bottled up. Perhaps it was to avoid the embarrassment of breaking the illusion of her steadfast leadership, because although she was now in control of one of the 2 most advanced militaries on the planet, she still found herself feeling so much younger at times. She hated this so much that she would pinch herself whenever a girlish thought came to mind, and try to train herself to grow up in a few hours. It did nothing but leave her with bruises. "Have you passed the order to wake everyone up?" she asked, keeping things to business. Yes, I have," said Marcus. The sentence fell cut off, like there was more he wanted to say. He continued to stare at Cecilia, looking over her face until he settled on her eyes. Cecilia did not like the way he had done so, not because it seemed of ill intent, but it seemed strange. "Please, go and get a report on the sharpshooter team," she asked, trying to get rid of him. "Of course, ma'am," he said, looking like he was in some sort of pain for a moment. He ran off, and after a moment the princess was left alone in her foxhole. There was 3 more soldiers within 10 feet of her, 1 in the front and 1 on either side. This was the team who was devoted to protecting her from capture, and it was something which she couldn't turn down. She understood that as the new commander she would need to be protected, and this was no comment on her position in the royalty of Sicily. The king of the chessboard was the heart of one's pieces, and if it was cornered, then the whole resistance would fall. Binoculars from the pouch on the princess's belt revealed nothing more of the enemy to her than her naked eyes, but she took a moment to look far to her right. The forest, with its very slight elevation over the field, had an outcropping, almost like a peninsula. It was well wooded, and held a team of the best sharpshooters in the guard. 5 men, well hidden, would hopefully wreak havoc on an enemy force marching towards the main tree line. From that far right and forward position, they could have an enfilade view of an advancing line. Finally, after 10 minutes, the first figures appeared over the ridge, following the course of the highway which curved left in the middle of the field. 5 men with caps of leather and— no, it was not that. Those men appeared several moments before any other men came over the ridge, because they were lifted several feet over the ground. They were tank commanders, standing in their turret hatches of 5 tanks in a wide formation that came before columns of troops. "Dear God above," said the princess. The men around her began cursing and despairing, so not only was there tanks, but there was column after column of brown uniformed soldiers, 6, 7, 8, 10, and then 14, and finally 20 groups of 100. 2,000 soldiers had come over the hill in narrow columns that followed in line, but they began to slow. The first column stopped altogether, and orders were given to them. From this distance, what was said couldn't be understood, but the orders soon made themselves clear. The columns spread wide and made densely packed battle lines. The army was within a few minutes divided into 5 armies, each with a tank at their front. The princess felt herself collapsing under the pressure, but held herself together by keeping focused on looking over the tanks. She could see machine guns, 3 on each. Each one had a 2-inch cannon in the turret and a man standing through the hatch. They were painted a yellowish tan, but one of them was different. The Central Army had a tank that was marked with blue stripes all around, and on its side was a pole which held a flag on its end. The flag of Florence, a deer crumpling after having been shot over a reddish purple. The tanks seemed to protect the 5 sections of men, all of which wore the dark brown uniforms of the men who had stood in the great hall of the Sicilian royal palace. Having grounded herself in the situation, the princess felt a bit emboldened. She was here, and had made her decision, the guard made theirs, and it was time to see it all through. Coming from behind, Marcus sprinted and then slid into the foxhole with Cecilia. He was panicked, and it was no mystery why. He looked to Cecilia for something like guidance, and she just told him, "Continue as planned. Are the sharpshooters ready?" He just nodded and chambered his rifle. Leaning forward on the front of the foxhole, he could now aim a clear shot at the mass of troops in front of him. Cecilia joined him and whispered, "Can you gauge the range to the front of the ranks? It seems to be about 1,200 yards right now. Way too far to be effective." Damn it, thought the princess. She knew that the sharpshooters would be out of range too, because they only sat an extra 200 yards forward from the rest of the battle line. She began to realize that the army had moved into battle position without any warning. How did they know that the Sicilians were here? It didn't matter why, just that it was happening. Her order to the men had been for her to deliver the first shot as a signal, and she waited anxiously until the moment would come. With the blow of a whistle from the central tank, presumably the commander tank, the whole army began to creep forward. The tanks moved at only 3 or 4 miles per hour, and the men hurried along behind. Their formation was a bit sloppy, but it served its function of intimidating the Sicilians. Florentian might was now clear and present, and the whole idea of the war was changing in the men's minds. This was not an insurrectionist militia controlling a few farms and a stretch of highway. This was a force sufficient to subdue the second largest city on Europa. They moved so fast and slow at the same time until the gap was only 700 yards, still far beyond the effectiveness of the rifles, but Cecilia was grappling with herself. Wait until they were close and they could make the opening volley devastating, or start harassing them at long range to slow them down and start inflicting some damage. The gap was now 600 yards. Her own rifle was not effective beyond 200, but as a signal device to begin the war it was sufficient. 500 yards. The gun blasted, and the whole plain went silent for a few seconds. The advancing army stopped, but the tanks continued on. The lead tank blew his whistle, and before the men could observe the marching order, they came under a hail of bullets. The range was now about 450 yards, and with some luck, some Florentians began taking rounds to their chests. Those few men hit at this range fell in agony, clutching the nearly half-inch wide holes that were suddenly punched into them. The Sicilians enjoyed exclusive rights to firing their weapons for about 3 seconds before the Florentian machine guns began rattling off dozens of rounds into the forest. The main cannons blasted shells filled with explosives into the slightly elevated area, but they never stopped rolling forward. The soldiers followed along behind, stopping every 10 yards to aim and fire into the forest. The exchange of bullets became so enormous in just 30 seconds that it was like a constant boom of thunder. The leaves and foliage of the pine and wild grapevines was shredded and shaken by the hail of steel-jacketed bullets, and the field became clouded with dust from the impact of Sicilian fire. The gap was just 375 now, and suddenly the difference was enormous. The number of invaders taking rounds skyrocketed as the skilled marksmanship of the average guard member showed itself to be deadly. The sharpshooters now had the near-perfect arrangement and began firing on the dense formation of invaders. It was hard to miss, and with such big, heavy bullets, which retained their energy, some men would be hit in the side by a bullet that had already passed through the bicep of another man and the ear of one before him. The situation became clear to the commander and his tank, and he delivered a triple blast on his whistle. The tanks increased their speed to 7 miles per hour and raced towards the woods. The men followed close behind, and the princess saw that there were only seconds before they would be overrun. She used a whistle of her own dangling from her neck to signal retreat, and to her relief the order was repeated by other men's whistles down the line. Just before she jumped from her foxhole, the princess looked to see the peninsula overrun. A tank had driven up the slight hill, laying down fire with its machine guns, and one of the 5 divisions spread over the small area and took it in just a few seconds. The loss was horrific, because sharpshooters of that quality were irreplaceable, and they were the closest things that the Sicilians had to a heavy weapon. The princess looked to see Marcus waiting with a few of the other soldiers committed to protecting her. She just nodded and began moving in the direction of the horses. She knew they had little time before they would be sharing the forest with thousands of Florentians. Ducking and weaving, the run was desperate and too real. One can read of battle all they like, but the moments of terror resulting from that peculiar knowledge of the significance and permanence of every decision are something that someone has to experience to understand. The princess now understood. "Hold here!" called Cecilia. In a split second the fire team around her slid to a stop and found cover behind trees. Although there was no reliable way to ensure that all the guard was stalling at the same place to hold off the enemy for a moment longer, she trusted in the judgment of her men. Laying behind a tree in a low spot, She saw that there was a very slight ridge only 15 feet in front of her. After 30 seconds, a brown shirt came over. Reflexively, the princess sent 3 shots into his chest, rapidly working the lever under her gun to chamber fresh ammunition. He fell dead, and a split second later 3 more soldiers came to stop on the ridge to evaluate the situation. Not expecting their assailants to be immediately in front of them, it was over before they had even fallen to their knee-to-hold position. Each man was blown away by the guard members laying in wait. "Move on!" called the princess. Time flowed differently in the place in time of battle like this, and although it had only been about 7 minutes since the firing began, it felt like a veritable eternity. The princess planned on stopping and holding one more time before making the final dash for the horses. And as she jogged to that next position, she fumbled with bullets from her belt to try and reload. Not paying as much attention to the dash for the woods as she should have, the princess came to a log and jumped over it to find that it was concealing a pool of cool, dark water. The splash shocked her terribly, and in the panic to keep afloat in the surprisingly deep pond, she let go of her rifle. It took only a second to realize the horrible mistake, but she let it go to save herself. The men with her had heard the splash and hurried to form a skirmish line on the opposite side to hold off advancing invaders. They wiped out a fire team of brown shirts that came upon them from a denser section of bush, and then tried to reload. Just as the princess crawled to the shore and took Marcus's hand to lift her out, another fire team of brown shirts came from the extreme right and took 2 guard members by surprise. Killed almost instantly, the other guard members returned fire, forcing the enemy team to find cover. "We have to move now!" screamed Marcus, practically throwing Cecilia towards the horses. The guard members began moving backwards, continuing to pin down the enemy fire team behind cover. It kept the enemy in place, and in a moment the Sicilians turned and ran to catch up with the princess. The clearing where the horses were tied off was finally reached, and the soaking princess could see escape in her grasp. Her revolver was in hand since she lost her rifle. Now she held it straight up to the air in a manner that allowed her to quickly drop it to a target. The moment came with a burst of fire from a patch of trees in a slightly recessed part of the forest, maybe 75 yards to her left. The guard members with her began laying fire on the position as she pulled herself onto her horse. From here she fired twice into the clump of vegetation and took a moment to evaluate her own forces. By now the survivors had been back to the horses, and she could see only 120 men assembled in a haphazard cluster. They were sitting ducks for the machine guns of the tanks that were forcing their way through the forest. Accepting the loss in the adrenaline-fueled moment, the princess screamed to the men present, "Felita Senna!" The men screamed it to each other, some riding about to tell the others, nearly deafened by all the gunfire. Another flurry of gunshots came from the tree line, and it was once again met with a massive amount of return fire. But this time it was not vanquished. It was joined by more pockets of enemies, and it was clear that the forest was now empty of any Sicilian forces. The princess snapped the reins of her horse and kicked its sides, sending it into a gallop. Senna, 35 miles north of Sicily, was a very small village marking the overland halfway point to Genoa. Genoa itself marked the halfway point of the river of the same name, which flowed south from the northern mountains. North was the direction best to frustrate the pursuing Florentians, because the rivers flowed south and there were no good highways. A small mobile force on horseback could make good use of the intermittent fields and forests to move fast and throw off pursuers. Being an empty area nearly free of significant civilian populations made maneuvering simple. Shallow rivers and wild undeveloped land covered the central undeveloped region of the habitable zone of the Genoa River. It was to here that the princess fled, and it would lead her over the Sicilian River and through the wilds to the insignificant Senna. While her adrenaline still raged and her ears still rang, she could focus on riding, but as the midday sun sank and she began to feel her exhaustion, she also felt the greatest sorrow she had ever known. Greater than her father's death, it began to trap her into guilt and thoughts of failure. Although Marcus and the others tried to speak to her, she said nothing, and instead allowed her frustrations and sadness to burrow deeper into her heart. It was a long way to Senna, and by the time she had reached it, scattering farms, she was no longer the same bold princess that had the same day given speeches of bravery and patriotism. She herself began to doubt Sicily and the causes it stood for, and with a body and mind exhausted, she found herself sleeping in a barn on old hay. She cried without trying to stop herself, full of shame, but she couldn't help herself. The day was too devastating to do anything else. That is the end of Chapter 7 of Unfortunate Citizen.